Hey Providence family, it's Andrew McGill, and I get the pleasure of walking us through the tail end of Judges, the book of Ruth, and 1 Samuel, the very first part. And our psalm this week will be Psalm 37, and we'll be covering Judges 13 all the way through 1 Samuel chapter 8. And even though we are going through three different books of the Bible, we're actually just looking at one period of Israel's history. And here's what I mean. Judges is obviously about the judges. Ruth takes place in the Judges, and then 1 Samuel up to chapter 8 is really the end of Judges. And so even though we'll be in three different books of the Bible, it'll actually just be one period of Israel's history. And as you read this week, I want to point out three major things to help us make sense of everything going on. The first thing I want to point out is the Judges cycle. Andrew kind of mentioned something about this last week in his video, but here's the Judges cycle. The first, everyone does what's right in their own eyes. The second stage is God hands over Israel to their enemies. Stage 3 is the people of Israel cry out. Stage 4 is God raises up a judge to deliver his people. And stage 5 is there's peace in the land. And then usually the judge dies and the cycle repeats itself. And so this week, we're going to be reading Samson, and even the hero of the faith, Samson, falls into this cycle. And as you do, I want you to pay attention and see if you can find those elements. And the other thing I want you to look at during this week is how the book of Judges ends in that cycle and how the book of 1 Samuel begins to kind of reverse that cycle. Judges ends really dark and twisted, and 1 Samuel starts very hopeful and bright. And so try and pay attention to that. The second main thing I want to point out is that everyone in Israel is progressively getting worse, particularly the leadership. As you read the tail end of Judges, there will be some miserable stories, and they're just absolutely shocking. And this is actually on purpose. It's on purpose, and even Samson, the hero of the faith, he is the quintessential misery of Israel because he marries the enemy twice, he breaks his vow to the Lord, and does everything the wrong way. And we're supposed to finish the book of Judges wondering, how is God going to break this mess and fix everything? And then we're supposed to read Ruth and catch maybe a glimmer of hope. And then as we get into the book of 1 Samuel, we're supposed to see Eli and his sons and go, oh no, here we go again. The leaders of Israel are still terrible. But then we're introduced to Samuel in sort of a miraculous way, which kind of leads me to the third thing I want to point out is I want us to look at the fact that God does not forget his people. At the end of Judges, we're left with a dismal view of God's people. They're in a terrible state and a seemingly unbreakable cycle of judges. And after the gruesome scene at the end of Judges, not only is Israel at war with other nations, Israel is on the brink of civil war. And that's when we're introduced to Samuel and his miraculous birth. 1 Samuel 1, verses 9 through 18, is this scene where Hannah goes into the temple to pray before the Lord, and the priest, who is supposed to be worshiping the Lord, finds Hannah deep in prayer and then accuses her of actually being drunk. And this is a tragic scene because the high priest, Eli, had not seen someone pray before the Lord in such a long time that he mistakenly thought Hannah was drunk and babbling irreverently before the Lord. But if you keep reading, you will see, that a barren woman miraculously gives birth to a son. That son is Samuel, and Samuel begins to hear from the Lord. The voice of the Lord returns to his people, and as the voice of the Lord returns, it brings with it the end of the Judges era. In 1 Samuel 8, we're going to see a monumental shift in the political climate of Israel. This closes the Judges cycle permanently because God will make a promise to King David that there will always be a king on the throne of God's people. And so one quick note on Psalm 37. It's going to read very similar to maybe a chapter in Proverbs. It has a lot of wisdom and good coffee mug verses. And in the midst of all of that, I think you will quickly see that there's this impossible call to righteousness in Psalm 37, and it's unobtainable. But the good news is that Jesus perfectly fulfilled the righteous requirement laid out in Psalm 37. And we get to read Psalm 37 with comfort because if we believe in Jesus, that righteousness is actually accredited to us. So my challenge to you this week is to read through a few verses of Psalm 37 and see if you can't see any other consistent themes in this week's reading. And I'm praying that the Lord will guide you and encourage you this week as you read, because the tragic downfall of Israel sets up for our eternal King, King Jesus, who is ruling and reigning today. Until next time, see ya.